Hello, good afternoon, gentle readers. It's December 1, 2024. So today in Logos 2000, the new series since a few weeks ago, has been discussions of metaphysics modernly, 21st century foundations, and the discourse and the rationality of it. And as with regards to the time and place of the development of the theories, as philosophy keeps turning over to reflect that it says of an enduring tradition, and it's something that comes down to us in the silver thread called time, and a continuum of time and the history of it, that this historiography of it arrives at both a development of the lenses through which we can consider and make as of deconstructive and reconstructive accounts of these thinkings that live, that endure since these ancient times, often with regards to this great traditions called the ancient Greeks, matters of rhetoric, discourse, logic, and reason, and the Platonic and the ideals, Greek idealism, and then with regards to much later, the continental or German idealism, those being held up as kind of the greatest aspects of what's considered the technical philosophy. And then that in the course of its evaluation and consideration and the pragmatism and making it so that in the practice of philosophy, then it's associated with psychology and behavior and the human condition, the bet human or human condition, that it's as well right at very much the analytical traditions, that each of these periods of great development and the wealth and the treasure, as it were, of the outcome of idealism also has associated with it the analytic tradition, and how to make of it from the particulars of not necessarily being able to comprehend or grasp that is the ineffable or that which is the supreme, that which is the absolute, these being as about our ideals, yet as well how to relay and make for a phenomenological account that means to relay unambiguously and in a very concrete setting how these things can arrive for the analytic, and then what that means for the analysis and the methods of mathematics and logic, and whether then those are sciences and a scientific approach, the analytic or this side of it, the subjective side, and is whether there's an intersubjectivity that's for everybody, or that there is, besides what's considered objectivity at all, for anything for itself, that there's this interobjectivity, reality at all. So here there's generally considered that there's a universe and in it is reality, and that whether or not me or anybody else makes that case, has that, it does not matter, because there's an abstract, arbitrary, any thinking being that does. So that just goes to show that what can be interobjective in terms of a shared reality doesn't need to share anything else at all. Anything else that's phenomenological or even perceptual, as with regards to the interpretation of perceptions. While at the same time we have this great strength of metaphor and text, and the ability to relay things and so to abbreviate it as syntaxes of the forms, which then make to relate these semantics of the things. And so sometimes people will poo-poo and put down semantics as that's merely semantics, or metaphysics as, oh, that's merely metaphysics. And that's unfortunate, because what happens is they've confused the equivocation and prevarication, which are some approaches that can be relayed and framed in terms of these concomitant aspects of philosophical reasoning and truth. They've confused those with greater truths. So it's just to be said that here there's made a very strong account that this stronger mathematical Platonism is necessary to make a stronger logical positivism, which otherwise for itself is weak and can be kind of so put down as not following its own principles and thusly not arriving in its own statements. So here, for example, this was put as for the theory of science, and first principles and final causes. Well, that's the theory, and that's science of it for you. Just to make an example to show that some of these other aspects was like, we can't say they exist. It's like, you can't say they don't. And that being with regards to usual kinds of notions of the unscientific or super scientific, yet as well that is kind of an as with regards to that's the promontory, that is the surface that is enduring and when turning things over does re-arrive. So in brief metaphysics about semantics, it's a theory of truth, which modern analytic traditions have a pretty hard time defining. It's just like, well, whatever we agree is, and nobody raises an objection, vis-a-vis that being just kind of like an agreement, which of course on its own sake is perfectly great. That otherwise there's something along the lines of that there's a wider teleology that arrives at a great ontology of all the objects of logic and mathematics, and even connections to reasoning, the space of words, as was kind of brought up in these recent episodes, that it is always there and it's true. That then, of course, we are finite creatures of limited means, yet that we have a mental sense that can grasp at least the sublimity of Kant, the Ding an sich, as of a noumenon, that is as well directly phenomenological in this sense as well. That it's describing, to give it to a sense that we have of our apparatus, is that the sense is something that is intersubjective automatically. There's oftentimes a question in philosophy is like, well, we have the same names for colors that we've seen all our own lives, but is red, and red again to people with different eyeballs? Do they really see the same color? Is their brain really of the same color? And the answer usually is that, well, it's immaterial, because we have some reference standards that we agree are the same for everybody. And so then what is, besides our theory of color, which here it involves some features of visible light, which is special. Besides our theories of color and the additive and subtractive colors with regards to lights and filters, and then as with regards to the prismatic and chromatic, what's usually is with regards to a display screen and receptors that build for the exact same outputs of this display screen that we all learned as red, green, blue, and the composition of that, and pointillistic tiny particles to make the appearance of a continuous tone image. That this prismatic and chromatic also make, as besides for the additive and subtractive, for matters of propagation and transmission of light, and then also its reflection and absorption, work to help to effect to reflect that there's a dual tristimulus color space. And as of with regards to that being of various means and measures to help make it for so that in the phenomenological sense, it's matched up with these theoretical underpinnings, then arrive at things that are reproducible in the experiment. That is science, that it gives us not just a temporal, instantaneous, yet non-lasting, non-enduring agreement of things, but they're facts of things that, for once they are so, are always as ever having been so. So then, reading from Husserl, last episode, we got into the actuality and then the potentiality of being, and what makes when Husserl is trying to make for existentialism and nihilism, that because of the great put down of the idealistic tradition, and this idea that There is no metaphysics. Our metaphysics is that there is no metaphysics, which is, it's kind of self-defeating if you look at it that way. To make for that there can only be this purely phenomenological interpretation of things that Husserl considers with regards to the actuality, that being that there's not even anything real left anymore in that sort of theory, with regards to everything being subjective and dubious, whereas as Descartes might have put it, as of a great big lie, or the deceiver's acts, as Descartes might have put it. That is, well, we can arrive at it as like, well, you don't have to make it so that then you cast that the ontological commitment to truth is anything more than what all the other great historical arguments over time arrive at as for matters of origin and matters of identity and matters of self and the body politic and these kinds of things, to still arrive at there's just this briefest, merest thread, the silver thread here, as it's put, the shastra of that kind of idea that connects this teleological and true sort of thing with the greater, wider epistemological, semiotic, phenomenological matters of discourse, to just say that that's keeping it real and at the same time scientifically real. And so then the actuality that Husserl kind of says we need to have is something that I'll look to read a little bit more today, because this is kind of entering the 20th century then. And so then when it gets into, some of the later authors pick up Husserl's trail and try to help mend it back up. Because there's all these kinds of ways, just kind of where Wittgenstein was an anti-Plato in a sense, and Nietzsche was an anti-Plato in a sense, and Heidegger's an anti-Plato in a sense, that they were all originally and fundamentally Platonists. And then as well, it's got to be brought back to fill in the nihilism with existentialism and take down the existentialism with nihilism, so that together they make some dually self-infer consistent theory overall. And then that all these other notions of our theories of perception and agreement, coherent, correspondent, pragmatist theories of truth, actually have one as a prototype that they attain to and are, vis-a-vis these matters of logic and mathematics as Platonic and ideal, external to the apparatus of the consideration of our grainy bounds, the phenomenological. There still is a perfect circle. There still is geometry. There still is numbers. Starts with continuity and infinity is kind of the idea, and that then also that these matters of actuality, vis-a-vis otherwise what was discussed otherwise by Husserl, saying is like, I have a potential personal objectivity that he arrives at, that at least he can see why he would imagine that there to be this thing, reality, and this kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to read a little bit about today from some books I found today about these things. So the Husserl mentioned this is Cartesian Meditations, and so he gets into a great sort of account of the actuality and it being missing, and then trying to fill that in. And here's some books that we looked at here quite a while before. This is Lucretius is a great Roman scientist and philosopher of about 100 or 200 AD, and I don't always get those dates right, which is between about 600 or 800 BC, before like the Greeks kind of rose in terms of civilization, and 500 AD when the Roman Empire is considered to have fallen after it was torn down. That Lucretius is about at the height of Roman development after modeling and emulating the Greek development in idealism, and then Lucretius is observational and speculative abduction, his theories of these things are really just pretty great and profound. And so he's got ideas, thousands of years almost before Darwin of, the species and natural reproduction and genetics and all these kinds of things. He's got theories of light. He's got theories of imaging. He's got theories of physics and atomism, types of structure, what strike the senses. You cannot attribute the same composition to sights that feast the eye with color and to those that make it smart or weep or that appear loathsome or repulsive, those true arrogance. Nothing that gratifies the senses is ever without a certain smoothness of the constituent atoms. Whatever on the other hand. And so Lucretius entertains a great wide variety of dialectics. And he described things like flint and steel and the creation of spark to start a fire, and facts and aspects of the universe. A new aspect of the universe is striving to reveal itself. But no fact is so simple that it's not harder to believe than to doubt at the first presentation. This is that the usual inductive account is like, well, why do we believe the sun rises? Like, well, it did today. And then that makes a stronger account is like, well, it did yesterday too. And in fact, in living memory, it always does every day, which is why eclipses so terrify us, because that's a surprise. But we can't believe our eyes, but the lights are out. These kinds of things that were available to everybody for observation and speculation. So Lucretius, though, is just pretty great. And his collection here called On the Universe, or On the Nature of the Universe, is one of the first great approaches to the description of beyond the elements of fire and water as change and place, as it were, the ancient elements, as with regards to theories of substance. That Lucretius is about one of the great steps above that, right past the Greeks. And so he brings together a lot of those as influences, and then describes that as well with regards to the tradition of the history of the time. For example, about the Titans or these other things, people, creatures that are presumed to exist as part of this history after the antediluvian, the before the flood, and these kinds of things that come down as always having been part of the history. To then again, things with regards to later getting into ethics as after matters of animism and the species, and then these things. Picture a storm at sea, the wind scouring the water with hurricane force, and some high admiral of the fleet swept before the blast with all his lavish complement of troops and battle elephants. How he importunes the peace of the gods with vows, how fervently he prays in his terror that the winds too may be at peace and favoring breezes blow. But for all his prayers, the tornado does not relax its grip, and all too often he is dashed upon the reefs of death. So irresistibly is human power ground to dust by some unseen force which seems to mock at the majestic rods and ruthless axes of authority and trample on them for its sport. So here he just kind of seems to say is like, well, the natural order of things is the natural order of things, and it doesn't have anything to do with intercession or petitioning or being lucky or fortuitous, or as was often affected in these times, related to matters of fortune and good fortune. He's just saying that there's an objective reality. And so he's talking about in issues of the super and the natural, like mortals and the supreme. And then his next section is, we come next to the discovery of copper, gold, and iron, weighty silver, and serviceable lead. This occurred when fire among the high hills had consumed huge forests in its blaze. The blazes may have been started by a stroke of lightning or by men who had employed fire to scare their enemies in some woodland war, or were tempted by the fertility of the country to enlarge their rich plowlands and turn the wilds into pasturage. Or they may have wished to kill the forest beasts and profit by their spoils, for hunting by means of pitfalls and fire developed earlier than fencing around a glade with nets and driving the game with dogs. Let us take it then that for one reason or another, no matter what, a fierce conflagration roaring balefully has devoured a forest down to the roots and roasted the earth with penetrative fire. Out of the melted veins there would flow into hollows of the earth's surface a convergent stream of silver and gold, copper and lead. Afterwards, when men saw these lying solidified on earth and splashing with resplendent color, they would be tempted by their attractive luster and polish to pick them up. They would notice that each lump was molded into a shape. Then it would enter their minds that these substances, when liquefied by heat, could run into any mold or the shape of any object they might desire, and could also be drawn out by hammering into pointed tips of any slenderness and sharpness. Here was a means by which they could equip themselves with weapons, chop down forests, rough hew timber, and plane it into split planks and pierce holes in it by boring, punching, or drilling. So he's talking about the kind of the invention of metallurgy and the crafts and the industries associated with the material that is metal. Here it's kind of related to the idea of the Iron Age and the Bronze Age tradition, that there was a wide trade in Bronze Age artifacts thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. That's not like an ancient civilization of high technology, but it is an ancient civilization of Bronze Age technology that has artifacts from Mesoamerica all the way up to Missouri, across the Atlantic, points north, south, and east. So these then help describe that Lucretius's theory about these matters and materials and the metals is quite a thing. All right, well that's just a few pages here, and it just helps to reflect that he's got a lot going on. Polybius, this story is chronicles of pretty much the time of Hannibal and Flaminius and Italy, as after when they had their main strife in the very early part of the Roman Empire with Carthage, and so across the Mediterranean where all these kinds of struggles, and that Polybius also then talks about the government and the constitution of Rome and what became Italy, and it was with regards to the rule of law, and that being as part of the social contract, and that being as with regards to what he attempted to describe as part of a universal history, even though that by this time, within a couple hundred years of 0 AD, that he would be part of a wider tradition that already in some ways was quite more widely spread. And so this is sort of, if a universal history, it's of the Mediterranean basin, in a sense. Because though the Roman Empire survived for so long, and then it had so many influences on Europe and the European empires that later still rose, it's kind of why it still survives today. And so it's otherwise hard to find these things sometime, to figure out how they're still kept together and still kept around. This other book we read a little bit last time, and I'm really looking forward to reading a little bit more. And it's about Kant and Werner Heisenberg and Jorge Luis Borges, and their studies of the limits of thought, or that which infinity has no limits, it's limitless. And there's some biographical comments with regards to Borges and his influences. Talk about the history of eternity, the book Borges wrote in 1935, a turning point in his intellectual development, and themes or concerns would give shape to the Borges to come. And then later was the fictions, and later was the artifices, which have been kind of, some of them read here and looked at a little bit. Martin Knudsen, as a young man, Kant marveled at a prediction made by one of his professors, Martin Knudsen, that a comet that had last appeared in the skies above Königsberg in 1698 would reappear at a specific date. One evening in the icy winter of 1744, Knudsen invited Kant and some fellow students to his house to gaze through the mirror telescope he had made according to Sir Isaac Newton's own design. There Kant could see with his own eyes the astonishing power of Newton's theories as the telescope revealed the stunning tail of a comet splashed across the night sky. With a kind of, as we read from star lore and the idea of the study of the skies, that's been around for a long, long time. And so it is very, very cool, though, that these things work out. As it turned out, Knudsen's numbers were off, and the comet of 1744 was not the same as that of 1698. But they did find one in the sky somewhere. Knudsen's faith in the power of human knowledge to derive objective laws from observations followed largely in the footsteps of the 17th century German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who shares credit or blame if you happen to be a junior in high school with Newton for creating calculus and even invented the first mechanical calculator, a forebear of modern computers. For Leibniz and the rationalist minds that followed him, things appeared and behaved as they did because they were programmed to do so, and the programmer who determined the behavior was naturally God. For Leibniz's adherents, everything that exists and moves in the world does so because an entity has an idea of it existing and moving. Instead of wondering if Newton's laws have objective truth and stand for all time, and if so, why they work the way they do, rationalists could have faith that those laws accurately describe the interactions between all elements in space-time because they're all controlled for all time through what Leibniz called pre-established harmony. So this is kind of like that organic unity. And there's an idea that it's so that this sum of history, sum of potentials is really very much so quite real, and that that's all there is to it. And so it can be said that it was made so infinity ago, and it's going to be so forever. As with regards to the idea of the super scientific and intercession and petitioning, it has arrived at that is its own that's its own leap of faith, as it were. And after religious freedom, it can't really be said to be objective and inter-objective, though it may well be so true by any number of theories. When a comet comes back around in agreement with calculations made with Newton's equations for gravity, we don't need to account for the planet's actions on it. They have them, though. So this is kind of a part of the analytic tradition it was seen, because it just kind of says you can pick up and put down things, and if they don't work out, well, that's okay. Whereas it's regards otherwise, it's like, well, if they don't work out, they never were going to work out. And so these are the kinds of things to figure out. When Socrates met Parmenides and Zeno in Athens, he was still a bit of an upstart. As we read here from Zeno talking to Socrates, is relayed, and describing for him kind of why he needed to rethink and reread what he'd heard about Zeno, because it wasn't things to set them up to fail, it was things to set them up to think. Let's see what he says here. Philosophers who had thronged the agora for this grand occasion listened attentively to Zeno read from his book. But when he had finished, young Socrates leaped to his feet to challenge the imposing sage and his venerable mentor Parmenides. The visitors claimed that ultimately there exists one massive immutable reality and that any change is an illusion. Parmenides had concocted this theory as a way of dealing with the incompatibility between the fact that things change and the apparent constancy of these things. So here there's a least action, no change, and a least gradient, a little change everywhere is the idea. And then for all such matters, the consideration of the energy of things as its content is the entelechy of things as its connectedness. They go together always. So that makes for continuum laws as stronger than conservation laws. A very strong conservation law. For this strong mathematical Platonism and strong logical positivism. Now, the reader may certainly be forgiven for asking where exactly the problem lies with accepting there are things and those things change. Well, as we read kind of more from that at the time, it was given a discursive account, and it kind of arrives at for an Aristotelian account later that it's kind of included in with regards to what moves and the supreme mover or the unmoved mover and these kinds of things. It became a keystone of Plato's student Aristotle's theories many years later, and centuries after that would seep into the theological disputes that gave form to Christian doctrine, and we reflect on both Augustine, he's like, there's Platonism, and that includes Aristotelianism, now that you mention it. And then there's Aquinas, who's like, I've very much so employed Aristotle's arguments and filigreed them very, very carefully and nicely, that these kinds of things come together. The paradox of the moment of change, the instantaneous sliver of time when some particle must be both perfectly identical to itself in space and time so as to be the thing that changes, and somehow different so as to have changed at all. These are Egginton's words, and they help reflect kind of the notion of the extended body and the wave mechanics, and as well the idea of that at any given moment anything could attain all things that it could possibly be, and then it does. And then it kind of forgets everything that didn't happen, which is a way to say that otherwise, instead of having to have all the possible combinations always existing forever, is that they don't. There's this silver thread, and everything draws back to it over time, in a sense. Then you have some more parables and little stories about Kant and his biography and so on. And so it kind of goes back and forth between Kant and Borges. And then here he's talking about Parmenides some more, the paradox of Achilles, and what we call the classical expositions of the superclassical, or Zeno's thought experiments. If we assume time is infinitely divisible, we can neither age nor move, unless it's infinitely divided in a complementary dual of a sort of a model in its own regularity, and it's given constructively. For example, by Aristotle, you might almost say that Aristotle's continuum is the other one than Eudoxus's continuum, that usual one, even though he carefully aligned and cited himself, Aristotle did, with Eudoxus, and that he did as well bring up the idea of the iota values, infinitely many iota values equaling 1, the infinitely divided, kind of as discussed here in previous episodes about the uniting and united, the dividing and divided. Then again, no thing moves, no thing changes, because continuity is broken. Well, it's not. So he discusses Kant. Oh, and here we get something about Heisenberg, because he's talking about Bohr and Sommerfeld. With regards to after the electron physics and Thomson and Young and Millikan and establishing a ratio of E over M electrical charge to mass, relating that to electrostatic mass and quantities by these electrical quantities, and because what they could do is use electroplating to bring out a solution. The other side of the thing, that beyond the oil drop experiment, the other great leg of this measurement tuning was the electroplating and the precise measurement of mass associated with what was plated, or the anode and cathode, where the electroplating arrived. And so besides the oil experiment, where in a magnetic field, oil drops were basically given that they were charged, and so it was able to kind of figure out how much magnetic field would exactly balance the gravitational field. That then that's just related in terms of matters of charge that go into these things, how much mass got made for converting it to the electroplating things, that then that's related to what makes up for moles and Avogadro's number, so that part of electron physics is a thing. Then another part of it is because that's still just ratios, but then it gives numbers to things like Avogadro's number and the mass of an atom. And then as well that there's orbitals, and this is with regards to the black body problem, which added up to like a continuum of things, and we called the ultraviolet catastrophe, because in the spectrum of these things, by the time they tried to gather out the critical points and the crests of these waves and add them back up, they ended up with arbitrarily wrong numbers vis-a-vis something that balanced in the middle according to the configuration of experiment and the energy of experiment, to make up for these things, the numbers, and to quantify these things by quantizing them. That Bohr and Sommerfeld, they had some great results in that quite a ways after that. The electron physics, the ultraviolet catastrophe, what became the great success of spectroscopy, because according to this balancing in the terrestrial setting, as with regards to particular materials and constants, and as after the hydrogen line, because sodium has 3 lines, and these kinds of things, or as with regards to like Faraday's great experiments, magnetizing the light. Later Zeeman says, well, I just changed it a little bit, and now there's only one, and furthermore, now there's nothing left but this one. It makes it so that these days there are, and there always have been, of course, things like muon physics, beta decay, and even the doublet nature of the Higgs boson to make for as supersymmetric accounts as after the virtual and the antiparticles, and then the ENOs, the very small particles, and the large symmetry breaking particles in these models for neutrino, muon, and large hadron physics, besides electron physics, and all that's still particles, only because it's really continuum mechanics. And that's difficult to figure out. So reading about Bohr and Sommerfeld and Pauli, is a pretty, a close school, these people who ended up making this quantum mechanics. As Bohr cynically told an eager Heisenberg, it's much easier to find one's way if one isn't too familiar with the magnificent unity of classical physics. But then lack of knowledge is no guarantee of success. Indeed, ignorance is not a defense. And sometimes presuming too much is an offense. True to Pauli's expectations, Heisenberg made full use of his detachment from prior physical uncertainties. So the Heisenberg uncertainty is seen as another one of these superclassical accounts. How could it be that there's asymptotic freedom of the measurement at the end? It's like, well, these days, then that's also Solomon Weinberg's what made for Gross and Wilczek's or whoever it was experiment, gave them the Nobel Prize for finding quirky in physics and the asymptotic freedom of that. That makes it possible to unify the strong nuclear force and a little bit later the weak nuclear force with gravity as a force, because otherwise we have these things like reading from the nuclear physics where it's like, well, nuclear particles, nucleons, they are only attracting each other by strong nuclear force when they're in the same orbit. And so it's like, so they're really kind of an extended body then, again, to like make that mathematically possible. It's like, well, now that you mention it, that these are the kinds of things that are quirky in physics today too. Yet still, it's just atomic physics, uncuttable, the atomic physics. So this is a great little book, and it just kind of, it helps by exploring different times and places, and then how they kind of come together and perspectives on these. And that there are a few good experiments in the mental thought experiments of infinity and infinitesimals, and then mostly it's just kind of biographical about Kant, but about some few super classical notions and how they're arrived at, and kind of the formative moments that reflect these people coming together. And there's some about space-time and about swinging the bucket and these kinds of things, most of which kind of been related here in some of their thinkings about some things. And then the great notion of the subspecie eternitatis, that it's like, yeah, there is an actuality, and that our potential theory is a theory of some potentials, and even our classical arrival in the middle of, after electron physics, linear things that are neat, simple, with addition formula for vector addition, are one of those, a potentialistic quantity. So nuclear theory, that's what we're kind of following up with. But then when I look, here's kind of what it was arrived today then. So Hegel, there's this Science of Logic, and so this Humanities Paperback Library, edited by H.D. Lewis, is making a translation by A.V. Miller with a foreword by Jan Findley of the Humanities Press International from Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey's 1969, reprint in 1989, from the Wissenschaft der Logik of Hegel's. So Hegel wrote the Wissenschaft der Logik, and he's got the idea of cognition chapters, life, the idea, mechanism, the syllogism, the judgment, the notion in general, the absolute relation, actuality. So this is the chapter that kind of spoke to me when I picked this up was the actuality, because we've just been reading about actuality many years later, many decades later, of Husserl, and later a bit of Derrida, is about trying to figure out the actuality. And then for what's going to arrive us from Derrida is a bit about how can there be geometry when it's given away that mathematics and logic couldn't be more than a mere science, and so thus we're always dubious, and not just fragwürdig, but like fraglich, questionable, dubious. The mathematics and logic, which arbitrarily have always been considered true, because there is a perfect circle and this kind of thing. That this chapter on the absolute and then actuality are two pretty big things. Hegel is a giant, and so this book is for a technical philosopher, really the bread and butter both. This is something special for the idea of reason and rationality. So this is a great part of the logos as well again too. And also he mentions, of course, the same concept, how it is. And so on to infinity. This infinitude consists solely in the perennial alternation of the two determinations of the relation, in each of which the other immediately arises, so that the positiveness of each is the vanishing of itself. So this is like this dually self-infinite consistency of the void and universal together, always alternating. Might be one, might be the other. Whether or not it's both, it has to be the same either way. That this is a great thing though to read, because I connect that directly with a fact, and that it's a very much an absolute fact. So I'm much appreciative of this. The conditionedness, infinite divisibility. The antinomy of the infinite divisibility of matter was considered above under the notion of quantity. Quantity is the unity of continuity and discreteness. It contains in this self-subsistent one its fusion with other ones, and in this uninterrupted continuing identity with itself as equally contains the negation of it. So that's a great thing to help to reflect that these complementary duals, or these duals that attain to each other yet have inductive impasses either way, they have still this meeting in the middle of nowhere. And so, and then they pass and reach their completions, not as via induction, though there's an uncontradicted inductive course that it always goes that way, but to reach their completions, as here Hegel ascribes as to being part of a greater, fuller dialectic. So that this sort of thing from Hegel is something that would be the textbook for somebody who wanted to attach a teleology and a greater metaphysics. That this is surely entertaining the metaphysics. This book of Hegel's Science of Logic. Well, it is just so. He also fully intends to entail the analytic tradition is after it, for matters of reason and ratio and this logos. So Hegel is just considered great. If there's one thing I look for to find in this is that the nothing, because sometimes it's only kind of given to Hegel. It's like, what is Hegel known for? Well, he pretty much is known for being a great philosopher, and then he writes about nothing. So there's Kant with being or sein, and Hegel with nothing, or nicht, or nichta sometimes. There's a couple different words about it. And then there's, much later, it's like the end of the German tradition was Heidegger with time. And it's like, oh, you mean he talks about continuity? It's like, well, no, Hegel already talked about that, but it's just he was early in the 20th century, and there's a lot about him and that kind of stuff. And he talks about the ancient Greeks a lot through the lens, so there's translations, all this stuff. But Hegel, though, at some point in time is held up as being about nothing. And so but he goes together with Kant, and then he goes together with Heidegger only because Hegel's about being nothing and time. So Hegel is just a pretty great, thorough, altogether thinker. And after somebody like Leibniz, he mentions Leibniz. Ordinary thinking is struck by the proposition that no two things are like each other, as in the story of how Leibniz propounded it at court and caused the ladies to look at the leaves of trees to see whether they could find two alike. Happy times for metaphysics, when it was the occupation of courtiers, and the testing of its propositions called for no more exertion than to compare leaves. The reason why this proposition is striking lies in what has been said, that two or numerical manyness does not contain any determinate difference, and that diversity as such in its abstraction is at first indifferent to likeness and unlikeness. So I like this because he's always entertaining the both sides of the things. The law of diversity, on the other hand, asserts that things are different from one another through unlikeness, and that the determination of unlikeness belongs to them just as much as that of likeness, for the determinate difference is constituted only by both together. So then the followers of Hegel, of course, as you might imagine, they said, well, Hegel, after Aristotle, is totally, ultimately authoritative, so we better say that we're Hegelians and then have all these kinds of different approaches to things. So anybody after Hegel is like, has it that you kind of have to be your own Hegelian. And there's no being a left or right or new or red or green or white or blue Hegelians. There's just to trust that Hegel is true, and then anything else is on its own account. Well, so that'll be something to read later. As somebody, I had a brief conversation with somebody the other day, and I showed him this copy of Cartesian Meditations. They're just like, oh, a little light reading, and it's kind of satirical because it's like, well, yeah, it is. So after Heidegger, then this was kind of his student, or Gadamer. So this book called Truth and Method would also be related to the analytical tradition, because he basically is of this time and place and of the school of continental idealism. Then it changed to continental analytical tradition, or continental existentialism and nihilism, as these terms were created by Heidegger, and after this surrounds and these other proponents like Husserl and these other developers of philosophy in these times, after Boole and Kant and all that kind of stuff, and Russell and then into these things in these times, that Gadamer was he was a metaphysician again. And so it's kind of telling that Gadamer in his earlier stuff kind of just has all this stuff going on with change and stuff, and then there was all this stuff to do with the conflict, and in the middle of the 20th century, which was just one of the worst times in terms of the growth and the rise and the fall of many cultures around the world. And not just talking about the European conflict, and not just talking about the Stalinist purges or the Maoist purges, or later than that, the Cambodians and the Khmer Rouge and all this kind of stuff, or all these things to do with South America or Africa in terms of conflict and tragedy. That then Gadamer became a sort of, he's into hermeneutics, and he's a hermeticist, and what that means is he went back to metaphysics, and he went back to a tradition where it's kind of a refuge for itself of this kind of thing. So that's kind of my reading of his personality a little bit, and then what that then tends to entail is that he arrives at in this book like Truth and Method, with that basically reflecting teleology and ontology, or the ideological tradition or idealistic tradition and the analytic tradition. That here put together a strong mathematical Platonism and strong logical positivism. That Gadamer then arrives at this, at the end of his readings from one of his other works here, Amicus Plato, where it's back to being a Platonist school again. Let's see if there's something that comes up out of this. He's talking about the Bill, the Abel, the Abeldung. So this is images, copies. The essence of a copy is to have no other task but to resemble the original. We start from the view that the mode of being of the work of art is presentation, Darstellung, and ask ourselves how the meaning of presentation can be verified by what we call a picture. Here, presenting cannot mean copying. So this gets into various notions of communication, and also the act of kind of detached communication, and the idea of what makes as for the appearances of things. And then there's also that relates to Schopenhauer quite a bit, and as you could well imagine, he would be so influenced by Schopenhauer, but very, very strongly by Hegel, because Kant was given as like this most aesthetically inspired logical judge, but Hegel is given up as basically the mental logical giant of this tradition. All self-knowledge arises from what is historically pre-given, what with Hegel we call substance, because it underlies all subjective intentions and actions, and hence both prescribes and limits every possibility for understanding any tradition whatsoever in its historical alterity. This almost defines the aim of philosophical hermeneutics. Its task is to retrace the path of Hegel's phenomenology of mind until we discover in all that is subjective the substantiality that determines it. So this is the actuality also that Husserl is pointing at, and these kinds of things. So he says every finite present has its limitations, and so that's sort of a matter of definition, and it gives something to begin. So that's pretty nice. So there's much more to read from this, and it goes on. He says Hegel quotes Plato, and then he says Ernst Fuchs has given us a hermeneutics that he calls a Sprachlehre des Glaubens, i.e. a grammar of faith. His starting point is that language is the illumination of being. Then he starts from Heidegger in order to get over the modern entanglement in the subject-to-object schema. But while Heidegger is thinking of the attraction of language itself that comes from its original source and returns to it, Fuchs thinks of the interaction of language in listening to the New Testament as the attraction of the Word of God. So that's just to say that there are various resorts where the things will reach to like an absolute again or a relative again in the circularity of things with regards to the linearity and circularity of things. That makes for a course that's philosophical, but it's not necessarily the one so rendered here. An essay Übersetzung und Verkündigung makes it clear how this hermeneutical theory seeks to get beyond the existential interpretation of Bultmann. So this is about the theological aspects as with regards to the teleological aspects, which it would be considered that the theological aspects with regards to the supreme and the omni as with regards to a theoretical religion that there's nothing of only the least or weakest or the most evanescence, which some people have as a form of universalism, a theory of a theology. The teleology would in a usual theology, any teleology would only be given by the theology, and so here it's just like, well, that's kind of where it ends. You know, you're welcome to pick up for whatever reason, because it can ontologically be true, or it just be a matter of, as some main traditions like in Islam, the entire name of the religion is meaning given oneself to that is a conscious and voluntary act of giving away the otherwise any doubts or this kind of thing, and then it's usually so for most matters of perceived voluntary submission into faith for its own purposes and reasons. Again, not so much the point here. It's just an aspect of freedom of religion. Here the work of the phenomenological school has proved fruitful. When we talk about the development of Husserl's phenomenology can be seen, it seems clear to me that Husserl was the first to take the radical step in this direction by showing the mode of being of subjectivity as absolute historicity, i.e. as temporality. So that's a good thing to note, that Husserl is very much a realist, and he's very strong logically, and then he's breaking stuff down in terms of all these various traditions, or at least the one of them that is the main of a technical philosophy, that here includes teleology and analytic tradition. That Husserl is pretty great. So, then speaking of Husserl, here's Derrida on Husserl, though this is Husserl, Origin of Geometry. So, from... This is Derrida. Derrida writes an extenuated origin of geometry introduction. I was new to this when I found this today, so I'm happy to find this kind of like so. But what he says is that it's about geometry being a Platonic thing, and so analytic tradition or science can't really arrive at it. I mean, you could say that it makes some axioms and that they never appear to break, but that without there being kind of an absolute truth of these things, to make for the actuality of geometry is what he's seeming to describe. That geometry is always held up as kind of like the mathematics, and vis-a-vis all these other foundations and candidates and foundations of mathematics, which is kind of definitely a certain aspect in the Heno theory of all the objects of the domain of discourse of the universe of the objects of mathematics, geometry. That here Husserl, and then after Husserl, Derrida have about this. Reprinted by arrangement with Presse Universitaire de France and Jean-Pierre Lévy Jr., translated from the revised edition of Introduction à l'origine de la géométrie de Husserl. So, Derrida is a Frenchman, and Husserl was a German, and they spoke these ways. So, Edmund Husserl says, is die Frage nach dem Ursprung der Geometrie als intentional historische Problem. So, this is about the intentional historische problem with regards to geometry. So, introduction to the origin of geometry. Now, here you may be familiar with it. There's the usual course that there's an axiomless natural deduction, a theory, this whole universal and void, like Hegel was just telling us about. And then there's an axiomless geometry, of point and spaces being kind of these either sides of it. And then that in the middle has, just from a spiral space filling curves, a natural continuum to begin. Super classical, yet natural, and then primary. Makes for increment, dispersion, and dimensionality to make the objects of Euclidean geometry. Then here we'll be looking at a little bit more so with regards to Husserl's definition of how geometry lives, and there is a perfect circle as with regards to it, because a line is considered just so simple as almost to go without definition, but a circle can never be constructed. That there's it's just a usual touchstone of saying that geometry is Platonic in this sense. How's this? So the acknowledgments in the preface, Undeciphables and Old Names by Jean-Pierre Lévy, Undeciphables and Deconstruction, Derrida's Introduction to the Origin of Geometry, Deconstruction, the Science of Old Names, Translator's Note. Then there's this introduction to the origin of geometry, and it has these 11 chapters according to the Roman numerals. The sense of sense, investigation, responsibility, consciousness, and existence. The historical reduction and the necessity for return inquiry, Rückfrage, in reactivation. So after the Fraglich and Fragverdict, the questionable and that which invites questions, here's this Rückfrage of this return inquiry, or as with regards to revisiting the inquiry. 3, the ego as fundament and the reduction of factuality. 4, objectivity, historicity, and intentionality. 5, language, the possibility of transcendental historicity. And 6, the how of ideality, the earth and the living present. 7, the how of ideality, writing and univocity as the telos of reactivation. Oh, well, now that's a pretty remarkable idea, because it's getting into the telos, the purpose of this actuality, activation, and as with regards to writing and univocity. So many accounts you'll find in the analytical tradition are that the text and the writing can't really say anything, and there's nothing at all true anymore. And maybe I'm reading into that a bit too much of a pessimistic outlook, but maybe that's in a sense an optimistic outlook, because it's also kind of like you're free to make of it what you will. But then for some of these ideas that the univocity, which is kind of a concept that arises from Duns Scotus, one of the favorite medieval philosophers from here, have that this writing in university as the telos of reactivation, help reflect that there is such a thing. And then this chapter 8 says horizon, the absolute of history and imaginary variation. 9, the suspension of ideality, scientific study of the life world. Lebenswelt, the life world. 10 is geography, infinitization, and the idea in the Kantian sense. So this infinitization is kind of like Leibniz said, is like, it's everywhere. And as Hegel just said, it's like, you just look at it, there it is. And so here he's saying that if from the sense of the world, there's an infinitization. And then 11 is the historicity of the idea, difference, delay, origins, and the transcendental. And then there's an appendix by Husserl, the origin of geometry. So let's look to that briefly. Page 155 to 182. The interest that propels us in this work makes it necessary to engage first of all in reflections which surely never occurred to Galileo. Now, I don't know about that, but it's rather ambitious. We must focus our gaze not merely upon the ready-made, handed-down geometry and upon the manner of being which its meaning had in his thinking. It was no different in his thinking from that what is in all the later inheritors of the older geometric wisdom, whenever they were at work, either as pure geometers or as making practical applications of geometry. Rather, indeed above all, we must also inquire back into the original meaning of the handed-down geometry, which continued to be valid with this very same meaning, continued and at the same time was developed further, remaining simply geometry in all its new forms. Our considerations will necessarily lead to the deepest problems of meaning, problems of science, and to the history of science in general, and indeed in the end to problems of a universal history in general, so that our problems and expositions concerning Galilean geometry take on an exemplary significance. So the Galilean geometry is kind of as with the course of trigonometry in the course of after the analytic, mathematics, or after the Muslim Enlightenment, algebra and algorithmy and algorithm, that then it's for the more geometry. And then the modern, after the fourth dimension, the things like Riemannian and Lobachevsky geometry and non-Euclidean geometries, here it's as well, this like, we're just actually just building Euclidean geometry from beneath and making it so that there's no more stipulations anymore, that there's observations as after speculation. Well, have a great day, gentle readers. As you can tell, I'm kind of excited to find a little bit more of this course about the strong mathematical platonism and strong logical positivism together. And instead of kind of like a weaker logicist positive account, that kind of seems unsatisfying as not having anything true or mathematical or logical, only just kind of a timid kind of science thereof. That besides all the great acts and works of science that we keep, is again this great idealist tradition of mathematics, and that again is just very, very much stacking up the references that it can all be found to point the same way, and a lot of them after Aristotle and Hegel, two great heavyweights after Plato and Kant. Warm regards.